very much. So Shannon and I are going to tag team this presentation, as you probably gathered, and I'm going to give myself a timer so I give her enough time and we get out on time. We're just going to talk a little bit, so transitioning from insurance to some of those incentives, or not even incentives, but putting requirements in place so the communities have the right expectations about what can happen in our high-risk flood areas. So we're going to talk about some of the regulatory tools that we've developed over the last couple of years. We started developing this sort of suite of regulations several years ago now. There have been many partners. I work for the Cape Cod Commission. Shannon works for the county and Hui Sea Grant. And then we've had other partners along the way who've really been instrumental in developing these regulations. And I should note that we've received funding from the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs for much of this work, and we're currently doing work with funding from the Southeast New England program, SNEP program network. So many of you have probably seen the next couple of slides. Just very briefly, Cape Cod is extremely vulnerable to flood risk. We have 586 miles of vulnerable coastline. And we know that with climate change, increasing intensity of storms, and sea level rise, that vulnerability is only going to increase. 19% of the region is already located within the FEMA flood zone. That flood area is already greater than the FEMA designated floodplain, and will increase. And within those areas, there's $46 billion estimated of assets, property value assets in that area. So that's a lot. It's not all gonna get knocked out at once, but it's sobering to think about and should be a incentive for action. And briefly, I'm sure this crowd is probably familiar with sea level rise estimates. We are already seeing sea level rise. It's been a foot over the last 100 years or so. We expect another 2 feet by 2050 by conservative estimates. So why regulate development in the floodplain? For some of us, it seems sort of obvious, but I think it's important to just sort of run through some of the really important reasons that not everyone may think about. So again, we have changing weather and sea levels. With climate change, it's not just the seas are rising, but we have increasingly intense storms. They bring rain and wind-driven waves that can really impact our coastlines. It's our responsibility as municipalities, as we allow for new development or redevelopment in these areas, to make sure that they are built as resiliently as possible. So having the right regulations in place can provide us all with the right expectations for what resiliency looks like, and then also require the enforcement of that as things are permitted. And you're not just protecting properties right on the shoreline. If properties are just allowed to, on the shoreline, are allowed to build the way they'd like, there can be unintended consequences to properties beyond. Properties, people move, bring in fill, they build new structures that can channelize flooding. It redirects waters to properties that might not even be in the floodplain. Importantly, we're protecting the environment, and Mike touched on this. The environment is providing us with ecosystem services that we all rely on. At a basic level, it's helping to protect us from that sea level rise and flood events. And we want the environment to continue to be there to sustain us in its myriad ways. Also importantly, more development in the floodplain, when an event happens, we're putting our emergency responders at risk. And that's just not right at a basic level. So we have a responsibility to build smart, build resiliently. Similarly, by building appropriately, we can reduce infrastructure and repair and costs. And we can also, with less development in the floodplain that's vulnerable, more of it built more resiliency, we can reduce the costs for response and cleanup. So as we engaged our communities across the Cape in the development of these regulations, we heard a lot of comments from them about their objectives. Again, they wanted better tools to set those expectations and have regulations in place that would help to manage development in the floodplain. Wanted to help with managing fill and the placement of structures so that we could manage channelizing or avoid the channelization of floodwaters, and wanted to really ensure that our coastal resource areas have room to migrate landward. A variety of reasons really were the drivers for the development of these regulations. So in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act identifies the floodplain, also known in the Wetlands Protection Act as land subject to coastal storm flowage, or LSCSF. Identifies that as a resource area that is suitable for protection, or is a resource area that may be protected through the act. But there are no performance standards, and that language presently relies on the existing floodplain, that floodplain that has been delineated through FEMA and that we're all familiar with. So that is based on historical flooding, not future flooding. The state has developed floodplain regulations. They've taken public comment on that. We're anticipating that they're going to promulgate those regulations, but that hasn't happened yet. And I think there are probably a lot of barriers to actually getting those regulations promulgated at the state level. So thus, with our communities really interested in doing more to protect development in the floodplain, we worked together with these partners to develop a suite of regulations. They include these three sort of products, if you will. The Coastal Resiliency Bylaw was the first thing that we developed. It's a wetlands bylaw. It effectively gives a community the authority to regulate development in the floodplain. And importantly, in the model that we've developed, it allows a community to develop, to regulate a future floodplain if they wish. We heard from the communities that we worked with that they also wanted wetlands regulations that provided additional detail and guidance on how to implement that wetlands bylaw. So we developed a set of coastal resiliency regulations with a number of town partners providing direct input on the development of those. And then we also at the same time developed a zoning flood resiliency bylaw. This is something, so the first two products are something administered by the town's Conservation Commission. The flood zoning bylaw is something that your building inspectors, planning boards, zoning boards of appeal are implementing. This bylaw has higher standards that complements the higher standards that are identified in the other two products. So collectively, this is a suite of regulations that are meant to work together so that as town boards are permitting development, they're doing it consistently. And I have one more and then I turn it over. Okay, so just very briefly at a high level, these regulations are providing guidance for regulating the FEMA floodplain and or new areas that are anticipated to be vulnerable in the future. It is set up so that communities can sort of pick and choose those elements that they are comfortable regulating. So there's the option to expand your jurisdiction into that future floodplain that we've defined as the coastal resilience zone. And how do you define that coastal resilience zone? Well, you need to adopt a map that delineates it. And at the present time, the map that is the model that is sort of the highest standard or best model available at the present time is the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. Shannon will touch on that in a minute. And then there are options to, again, incorporate these higher standards, such as having buildings elevated to a design flood elevation that really will make them much more resilient into the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to take us on.
All right, so usually I help explain the difference between changes in flood zones by horizontal and vertical, and horizontal being the current floodplain is the front row of chairs, the future floodplain with sea level rise is the second or third row of chairs, and then vertically, I say, let's go from, say it's at the podium and it elevates to my shoulder. Now I'm going to start saying it's where I have to move the microphone down from when Heather talks. So that helps you understand what we're talking about with sea level rise, expanding the floodplain in two different directions. So this is a graphic of the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, which is a state model that was created by Woods Hole Group folks. And we have adopted the use of this model to help us understand where our floodplains are going to be with sea level rise. So we have some folks in the room who can give you much more detail about the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, but basically it indicates the likelihood of future flooding, taking that sea level rise into account. It uses sea level rise projections, historic and modeled storm data and landscape and a bunch of other factors, and provides flood extents and heights and there are a lot of other outputs. A lot of data goes into this, but we are using some very specific ones that are consistent with the way that things are regulated now, just to keep that as simple as possible. The way that flood zones work and that they're regulated currently by FEMA, so by the federal government. This graphic may be familiar to some of you, but basically it's broken into the different FEMA flood zones. So we've got the V zone, which is the highest risk. That's where we expect to see waves up to or higher than 3 feet. We have this new zone that's just become part of our building code called the coastal A zone or the moderate wave action zone. That's where we expect wave heights to be between 1.5 and 3 feet. And then we have our regular A zone. FEMA is really creative and uses A zone for 2 things. It's helpful. And then at the state of Massachusetts, we further complicate things and call them something totally different. So this is the minimal wave action zone versus the moderate wave action zone. But at least ours, even though they're different, they make more sense than FEMA. So then what we have in FEMA regs, we have this X zone, which is outside of the flood zone. Mike mentioned earlier the 500-year flood. It's the moderate risk flood zone. We don't regulate that right now. So what we are proposing is this new future flood zone. Again, this is horizontal. So this is going from this edge is the first row of chairs, and then the outside edge of this pink zone is the second row of chairs. So we're expanding it horizontally that way. So we have this broken down by these different zones. And then we also have standards for what we're calling special transition areas. Those are to allow for the migration of wetland resources. And then we also have standards for redevelopment sites for areas that are already pretty heavily developed. Also, I am aware of our time, so I'm just moving along here. A summary of the standards. So this is in the wetlands and zoning. So Heather mentioned we've got things that are administered by the conservation commissions and zoning. So we have some limitations and prohibitions on development by flood zone. So no new development in the V and coastal A, that's consistent throughout. No structural expansion in those zones, and limits on fill and certain engineering analyses required when fill is going to be used. You cannot redirect or channelize floodwaters or increase elevation or velocity. You have to restore natural features where possible. I should also note that some of these are coming directly from the DEP regulations. So once those eventually pass, every conservation commission is going to have to adopt those anyway. They will be state regulations. So we're just trying to get ahead of those because DEP has been working on them for just a few years. Then we also have prohibition on storage of hazardous materials in these areas and no rebuilding after 2 substantial damage determinations. That is the only thing that gets at retreat in these bylaws. Otherwise, we'd be looking at takings cases, and we don't want to get into that. So basically, if something is substantially damaged twice, you wouldn't be able to rebuild it in that location. There are also some standards that are only in wetlands or only in zoning, and there are reasons for that based on what you are allowed to regulate per which type of board you're working with. So in only wetlands, that's where elevation comes into place. So Heather mentioned elevating to the design flood elevation. That is through wetlands. So that would be elevation of substantial improvements or any tear down, raise and replace projects must use the best available flood or sea level rise data, which right now is the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. In the future, it could be something else. We're just saying whatever the best available data is, that's what should be used. In only zoning, measuring the building height from that design flood elevation, some towns love that, some towns hate that. Up to you how you all as towns want to do that. And then there are a bunch of things that for the sake of time, I'm gonna skip going through in detail. But basically, over 10 years of working with building departments on the Cape, these are all issues that have come up and that we have the ability to deal with at the local level. So basically, closing loopholes in the building code and some clarifications from the building code that will help make our building commissioners' lives a bit easier and just make everything more consistent and improve our flood safety for anyone who's building in these areas and protect our historic structures. So has anyone adopted these yet? We have been in conversations with town staff for 9 Cape Cod towns, Nantucket, and 4 towns on the Vineyard. They have not been completely adopted, but we have had lots of conversations, and we are also working with the Pleasant Bay Alliance with Chatham, Harwich, and Orleans, and we have been through multiple meetings with the various towns and their conservation commissions to start looking at which aspects, which provisions of these would they like to adopt. Also, I'm on the Dennis Conservation Commission, so Eric in the back there has to deal with me saying, Dennis Conservation Commission, we're gonna do this too. Also important to note that Chatham, and with the Pleasant Bay Alliance, Heather mentioned the SNEP funding for that as well. So in addition to that work, Chatham, Yarmouth, Mashpee, and Provincetown all have versions of this available, or of the regulations in their regulations. Chatham in 1993 prohibited all new development in the V zone and all new dwellings in the A zone. Yarmouth adopted some provisions of our bylaws very early on. Mashpee has some extra higher standards. And as you heard Tim Famulari mention this morning, Provincetown just last week adopted some aspects of the bylaw via town meeting as well. So if you want, I know this is super fascinating to everyone, so if you want more information on this, we have this whole website. You can do a deep dive. There's a lot of data available on that. Heather and I are always, of course, available as well. We have a communications toolkit that we're encouraging towns to use if they do want to pursue parts of these regulations and get them through their conservation commissions or their town meetings for bylaws. We also have a data viewer. We have several maps available. This really helps you understand what we're talking about visually. So it shows, we've got maps that show the current FEMA floodplains and the buildings that are in them. We have the maps that show the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model, 1% annual chance floodplains for 2050 and 2070. So again, incorporating sea level rise and what structures are in those flood zones or those floodplains. And then actually, in addition to those in the mapping data viewer, we also have a comparison of elevations from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model and the building code requirements so that you can see how those compare. And then also the Pleasant Bay Alliance has a great overview on their website and recordings of much longer presentations that we've given, giving more detail on this as well. Timeline and next steps. So this technical assistance, the SNEP-funded technical assistance with the Pleasant Bay Alliance goes through September of 2026, at which point we will not just drop everything and run. We will still be available, but we'll be focusing on those towns through September 26. We're working on draft model regulations, adapting them for each town. With ongoing town coordination with the goal toward adopting the bylaw or the regulations, hopefully over the summer, and then the bylaws at next spring town meeting, 2027. And then we plan to continue providing support to those towns as well as any other towns who are interested in adopting these regulations. And in the meantime, we are doing more focused meetings with conservation commissions and talking in a lot of detail, going through all of the detail, all of the regulations and what they want to adopt. So with that, we are over time. I know you all want to get out to that beautiful day outside. So thank you all.
Thank you. I know we're right at time, but if you want any questions for Heather or for Shannon, I think we could take a couple.
Pleasant Bay Alliance, did Brewster opt out? Be as brutal as you can.
Because brutal. I'm being recorded. So actually, Chris isn't here, is he? No. I just talked to Chris Miller, the Natural Resources Director in Brewster yesterday. There are a lot of there's a lot of bylaw work that Brewster wants to do, and they had already been in progress on some other things. So they are going to focus on finishing those things first, and then they will take this on. But they very much intend to take it on.
Real quickly, that you mentioned DEP. Do you any idea when they're going to have their regulations?
No, we wish.
Yeah, I think just on Pleasant Bay Alliance, I think one of the great things about that group is that they see strength in numbers and really want to, the 3 towns that are actively engaged right now really want to try to adopt regulations more or less on the same time frame, so that they are advancing these things together as a region. And as Shannon indicated, when Brewster is ready to join, we'll have a model ready for them to work with.